Okay, we've got 53 people on the Zoom call. Welcome everyone. This is our global engagement webinar, and as we John, our university's done a lot of work in the international sphere over the last 25 years, and so I see a lot of our folks who are involved in that work on this call. Maybe nothing has changed as much in the last 7 months as the international arena. As we think about, we had a robust international leadership training program that was literally bringing in millions of dollars. We had a long-standing English Language Institute. We had typically 900 Chinese students physically on campus here every year. We had dozens of partnerships. We were approaching 1,000 study away students, and we went down, I think, to 3 by the end of the summer. And so as we think about international enrollment, fundraising, student experience, many of those students that were here really struggled over the last 7 months in the pandemic. Visa challenges, research partnerships, so much in the international arena seems to have changed, at least temporarily. And so really looking forward to John Barnhart, who's with EAB leading our discussion today. John was a part of establishing the research forum at EAB and is a strategic planner and thinker. And I see our friend Paul Gunther on the call as well. And so, John, with that, let me ask you to introduce yourself a little more and then kick us off, and I'll put myself on mute.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you all so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be with you, in part because of what Cliff mentioned, which is of all the things we could be talking about right now, I think the growing complexity of global engagement is probably top of mind for a lot of you all. I'll say up front here, I hope nobody expects to walk away from this session with all of the answers. If I walk away from this session with any answers, I will be pleased, but I suspect we'll be learning a lot from each other throughout today's session. I am happy to present what we have put together, but I expect to learn a lot from you all. And I really am expecting this to be a robust discussion. So with that, I'll go ahead and steal the screen here so that I can share the PowerPoint deck with you all. So 1 second as the camera shifts. And there we go. Hopefully you're all seeing my screen now. Perfect. Well, again, this session was a labor of love at EAB, as I'm sure many of you can imagine. In any context, international engagement is a lot of people's jobs. And the number of you on this session today really shows me exactly how many people's jobs are probably involved in cultivating the global engagement experience at Missouri State. And so my team and I actually started putting our heads together on this content in November of last year. We actually put the final touches on it during my last visit to the offices in EAB in Washington, D.C. in that last week of February. And it was about a week after that that I think the wheels really started to come off the wagon. So what you'll see today is inclusive of the impacts of the coronavirus, but I wouldn't say it's exclusively about the coronavirus. And in fact, I'm going to go out of my way here to talk about trends that I think supersede the coronavirus and are trends that I think will continue regardless of how coronavirus continues to impact our international engagement efforts. And so I will definitely talk about it. It is certainly the elephant in the room on this topic. But I think a lot of the trends that we see exacerbated right now in October were present in January as well. And frankly, coronavirus has made many of them worse, but hasn't ultimately augmented them in a way that they are unrecognizable. So today you will see things that are probably pretty familiar to you. You might also get to see some new content, have some ideas or pre-held notions challenged a bit. And that's where I'm hoping this can be a really robust discussion. So for those of you that are listening in on the line, I have the Q&A panel open in front of me here, eager to see your questions, and I'll do my best to moderate and answer them as we go along. For those of you in the panelist mode, please, as we go throughout this, feel free to unmute yourselves and jump in or raise your hands with questions. Really excited to hear from you all in an active way as we go through this. But as another quick point of introduction, again, my name is John Barnhart. I head up EAB's University Research Forum, which means I primarily spend my time working with large R1 research universities on the various challenges that face the research enterprise. And certainly global engagement is one of them. I would say next to enrollment, research has probably been the most impacted, positive and negative sort of aside there, by the changes in the way universities engage on a global scale. And so while I am excited to be talking with you all, I did want to let you know that I will be giving you homework throughout the day today. And we're going to see, hopefully my first slide transitions perfectly. There's a couple questions that we're going to revisit throughout today's session. I'm going to start with this first one here, which you can sort of think of as the personal question. What did you learn that confirmed things that you already knew about global trends today? And then to what extent did you learn anything new? Or did you see something in the presentation today that changed the way you will think about global trends moving forward? The second question I'm going to be asking you a lot today is sort of in your capacity as a leader or as a member of the Missouri State community. What actions do you want to take or things that you want to do differently in your unit or in your office or in your division with the information and the context that we walk through today? So thinking a little bit more in your capacity as a manager and your capacity as a leader. And then the last one here, probably the most important, the one I will be bothering you the most with throughout the day, is how did the content from today's presentation connect with how you see Missouri State University engaging globally in the coming years? This is not only sort of the university-wide scale that I'm asking you to look at, but I'm also asking you to look 3 to 5 years forward, maybe thinking about that 2026 deadline of the long-term plan here, and giving us a sense of where you think the university is going and how today's content changes that for you, either reinforces the direction or makes you think differently about how you might approach those goals or approach those initiatives in the months and years to come here. Maybe this would be a good chance for me to go ahead and get a couple of the panelists engaged, starting with a quick question here. Maybe we could just get a few folks to either chat in the word box here or unmute themselves and tell me a little bit about where you see the initiatives currently. How would you describe in a couple words the current state of global engagement at Missouri State University?
Brad, why don't you jump in?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Brad, education. I guess the phrase I think of first is student focused. We put a lot of emphasis on international enrollment. We put a lot of emphasis on providing a good experience for students who come here, because not being a name brand university internationally, word of mouth and the experience that students have either individually or part of a cohort program is really the way we grow. So that's, and other colleagues are here on the line. They may have other perspectives and want to add to that, but that's what comes to my mind first.
Student focused, excellent.
This is Jim Baker. I'm Vice President for Research and Economic Development and International Programs. What Brad's saying is we have a really strong focus on students, both students going away and students coming here. And so we'll continue to do that. My primary focus is trying to keep a Band-Aid on all the relationships that we've established over the past 20 years. We have multiple partnerships in a lot of different countries. And so what I'm focused on primarily is sustaining those or keeping those relationships together. And then hopefully that'll build as we get into the 5-year plan. If we can keep our partnerships together, that'll really help us to get our plan implemented. So that's where I'm spending most of my time, but Brad and Brad's spending his time doing a lot of stuff like that, but he's also focused on students.
Excellent. And anyone else want to give us a couple words, couple quick descriptions of how you see the university currently in that global engagement? And as you can see on the slide there, I'll be asking you to think a little bit bigger picture, a little bit longer term later on in the presentation.
This is Paula Moore. I think right now, because of the last 6 months, the circumstances around COVID, we've innovated a lot in terms of how we do outreach, and using this technology we're using right now to reach places that we wouldn't have normally been able to reach or go. And with very little money involved, to get students engaged with the university through a kind of combination of teaching plus marketing and that kind of activity. That's a new kind of initiative that we've started, and I think that's just going to continue in the future.
Hi,
Excellent.
John. I'm Jane Robison, and I direct the English Language Institute. And I want to piggyback on what Paula said from the standpoint of instruction and how we had to pivot very quickly, of course, in the spring and transition to online mode of delivery. But we've taken advantage of it. And we're offering a lot of things that we never thought we'd be offering before, or didn't think we had the bandwidth to, but out of necessity, we're doing it. And they're leading to some nice outcomes, I think. And so we look toward having those students back on campus with us in the future, but we're also meeting a need for those students who can't afford to come here for the whole time to study with us. Right. They're able to save money by studying with us online. And so I think this is here to stay. I think we have discovered a niche there for us, and other programs have as well. But it's also been a positive experience in a lot of ways. Thank you.
No, thank you. This is wonderful. You can imagine even just 15, 20 years ago when we used to talk about international engagement in higher ed, the words we would use to describe our engagements were transactional. We talked a lot less about engagement, a lot less about innovation, a lot less about partnerships, and we talked a lot more about agreements. We talked a lot more about exchanges, words that don't necessarily necessitate that feeling of inclusion, that feeling of empathy toward all the populations we work with, but the vision, and they don't always communicate as well, the longer term vision. A transaction is a great engagement, but it may not last as long term as a genuine partnership. And so one of the things we're going to talk about today is obviously the role of building larger partnerships is incredibly important, especially in 2020. It's arguably far more difficult, if not the most difficult time ever, to be building large-scale, robust partnerships with other countries, with other school systems around the world, with other universities in other countries. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about the nuances, what has become easier since we're all on the same platform and anyone can be accessed via Zoom, but also what's become harder. Global trade policy, domestic policy here in the US regarding certain countries, a lot of it's become more difficult. And so we can't simply assume that all forms of international engagement are net good the way they were even just a decade ago. And so that's a big theme we'll be unpacking today. Perfect. And so our goals for today, again, are to first and foremost go a little bit beyond the headlines. Certainly, we are all familiar with some of the big trends that have unrolled in higher education, especially in the international space across the last few years. It's been tough to keep up with all of the headlines about global news in 2020, even just in the last few months. So today I want to go a couple levels deeper beyond what we might be seeing in the periodicals that we read every day, and that our students and our faculty and our staff and our communities overall might be getting access to more information, but that also means they might not have all of the information they need to fully understand our situation and where we want to go. I want to get everyone up to speed on what's happening across campus and across campuses. I think historically, international engagement was one of those things owned by just a handful of people at an institution. Increasingly, we all realize that part of our job, it might be a small part, is to engage those international constituencies in a bigger way. And I don't think we're far away from everybody at the university owning a small piece of that international engagement. And so we'll talk a little bit about not only what those roles are and pieces that you might own, but how they've changed in recent years. We're then going to go ahead and dive into 4 specific areas, and I'll get to those on the next couple of slides here, and talk specifically about how our engagements are changing in those spaces. And then I want to provide you all with an institution-wide framework for how we can think differently about our new and evolving types of international partnerships. And then as part of our discussion, I'd love to get a sense from you all looking ahead of the decade's coming trends and challenges, where you see the campus going and how you want to see it change to be more engaging and more global. And as the box at the bottom of the slide points out here, and I've already said, today is not just about COVID-19. Again, I certainly think COVID-19 has exacerbated and in some instances accelerated many of the trends that we're going to unpack today. And we will dive into where COVID specific challenges have arisen. For the most part, we're going to take a pretty wide view of things. So getting into some of those headlines. Again, if you get your daily digest of news first thing in the morning, either in your inbox or on your television, or more likely on your smartphone or on your tablet, you've probably come across headlines like the one listed on the left here at some point in the last 12 months. I think this article from Inside Higher Ed came out just in March. Will the coronavirus crisis trigger an enrollment crisis? Certainly a big question we're all looking to unpack. But even if you go back just about 5 years, you'd probably see headlines like the other two here. The US charges 3 researchers with lying about their links to China and China's Thousand Talents program. Or you've also seen global news sources talk about US higher ed in a way that doesn't paint us in a very positive light. This article here from Times Higher Ed saying 1/3 of international students in the US feel that they've been discriminated against at some point during their higher education experience in the United States. And if you continue to read these articles, you get a good sense of what's happening in the world and what's happening in our sector, but you might start to lose some of those macro climate changes that are taking place in front of us as they relate to how US universities engage in the global market. And we've listed what we think sort of those 4 big categories are here on the right. Starting with those protectionist politics, I think we've seen a pretty good increase, especially during the Trump administration, where we are looking at policies domestically that are doing more work to keep things in the US and keep more things outside of the US. That pertains in some instances to immigration status. It also pertains to things like intellectual property. It pertains to the way that companies in the US spend their tax money or where they house their tax money. And so a number of policy changes from a political perspective are beginning to have an impact on how universities can engage globally. We also have these contested campuses, whether it's geopolitical or economic fractures on our own campuses. We're beginning to see them trickle down into how our students engage with the campus and how our faculty and staff feel about their engagements. And we'll talk a little bit more about that experience in greater detail. The folks that used to be our long-term collaborators, we now might be seeing as potential competitors. International universities have really emerged as strong competitors and are making a pitch to their domestic citizens to stay in state or stay in country when it comes to pursuing higher ed, whether it's an undergraduate degree or a graduate degree or a doctoral degree, or even just to make sure that they stay here to get a job after they graduate. And then, of course, I don't need to tell anyone on the line here about the dramatic changes to the regulatory environment that we all live in. Many of you identified yourselves as working in some capacity related to international. I guarantee the amount of paperwork you've had to fill out in the last couple of years has gone up. The number of boxes you have to check has gone up. The number of data entry points you have to contribute to has gone up. And so this not only complicates our ability to form new partnerships and to sustain existing partnerships, it also puts a burden on you all, and you all feel the pressure more often to make sure that we're not only doing right by our international partners, but we're doing right by the agencies that are governing those partnerships. And again, as you sort of continue down the rabbit hole of these 4 categories, it can be easy to lose sight of those macro trends that are in front of us. So I'll go ahead and unpack those a little bit more here before we dive into the specific sections. The important thing to know is it's not just you. You may feel like you're learning about this for the first time or that it's coming at you faster than it ever has before. We are in a highly dynamic situation here. It feels like almost on a daily basis, international politics and policy are being reshaped, sometimes 280 characters at a time. And so I don't want anyone on the call here to feel bad if you haven't been able to keep up with the headlines or you feel like information you had a week ago is now out of date. We are all attempting to keep track of where these things are going and constantly having to reiterate on how we're going to prepare our institution to handle them. These issues are also interconnected. And again, thinking back to a world where international, in air quotes, was the responsibility of just a handful of people. In 2020, we all manage part of that responsibility. And if we are not engaging with each other in sessions like this one or in other meetings, we run the risk of missing some of those crossover points that could be good opportunities for the university. And on the flip side, could actually pose a pretty big risk to the university if we're not addressing them and unpacking them fully. That's where we run the risk there of that third point of disrupting the underlying business model of the institution. The first section we're going to talk about today is enrollment. Certainly that has the biggest potential impact, but we're also going to make the case about how student retention, research, and advancement contribute to our underlying institutional goals and our ability to deliver on providing the best-in-class education we can. And the last point I'll make here is that, again, the risks we have in our global partnerships and our global engagement strategies are not just additive in 2020, they're exponential. These risks are compounding on top of one another. And so, again, if we're not careful about being both more strategic and then also potentially more selective in the types of partnerships we pursue, we run the risk of sort of working our way backwards across these 4 trends. So again, today we're going to unpack 4 different areas of the university that global engagement has impacted particularly sharply in the last couple of years here. We're going to start by talking about enrollment trends, and I will front by saying that I know a good amount about international enrollment, but I am not one of the EAB consultants on enrollment. So if anyone has very specific questions, I'm happy to bring those back to my colleagues, but I'm excited to walk you through some of the macro trends in international enrollment today. We'll then skip over to talk about the campus experience. I title campus experience here. You can think of this both as student retention efforts, but also the campus experience for our faculty and staff who are international or who maybe have lived outside of the US for a period of time and are going through some of the same challenges that maybe we typically associate with undergrads. We're then going to skip down and talk a little bit about research. This is, again, my area of expertise, and so I'm excited to tell you all about some of the trends we see in the research, in the academic research world. And then we're going to conclude by talking about advancement, which I would actually say is the area that has been the most adversely affected by policy changes here in the US. And again, if you try to keep up with the headlines every day, this is the kind of news that doesn't always make the New York Times. And so we'll get into a little bit of the details that have been changing. Even just in the last couple of days here, we've had some development on the advancement front. And as we go through each of these areas, what you see in the middle of the bubble there on that slide, we're going to talk about the current state of affairs for each of these. And I'm going to walk you through some of those short-term trends. I'm really going to be looking to you all at the end of each section to tell me what you see as the long-term projections for your particular role and then for the campus overall. And what we're going to tease out as part of that discussion is some of those critical decision points. And it's those critical decision points that I'm hoping you'll all take away from the presentation today, along with some of the frameworks we'll give you all at the end on how to prepare to make those decisions. So before we move on to enrollment here, does anyone have any specific questions about the intro? Feel free again to either unmute yourself if you're a panelist or go ahead and drop it into the Q&A box. All right, well, I will be pulling up again to bring us back to those discussion questions as we move through just 3 slides on the enrollment section here. So again, starting with enrollment, what you're seeing on the left side of the slide here is probably a chart that's pretty familiar to you all. This actually, the data here only goes up to 2018, so you might have seen this across the last year, but effectively what we're communicating is There's been a stagnation. After several decades of continuous growth in international enrollment, specifically undergraduate enrollment, we're beginning to see both undergraduate and graduate international enrollment level off. You can really see this starting in about 2016 and continuing through on 2018. The colors on the line could be a little bit better. The top line is undergraduate enrollment. The bottom line is graduate enrollment. But you see the trend going in about the same direction. Both are beginning to flatten and dip ever so slightly. When we think about the impact of COVID specifically, we're likely to see these numbers fall off a little bit steeper especially in early 2020 and potentially through the rest of our spring semester. TBD on how we see that impacting the enrollment class for the next group. But I think it stands to reason that unless we get COVID under control, not just here in the US, but across the globe, we're also going to see our class of 2021 be impacted by these enrollment trends. And again, you can see that this decline, or the flatlining at least, starts before COVID is even introduced into the conversation. We're talking 3 years ago now. And a big part of that is the first bullet you see there at the top right. 4 of our top 5 markets for the US students have completely stagnated. The biggest of which is obviously China, Canada being another one. And then we've seen pretty sharp decline in 2 of the other areas, South Korea and Saudi Arabia. A big part of that is the second bullet. There is increased competition from international universities for these same student pools. You could really say that the cat's out of the bag here, and our counterparts in the UK, our counterparts in Canada and Australia have certainly learned about the allure of attracting international students from the same places where the US had typically gone time and time again, notably China, South Korea, and Saudi Arabia. And another factor to consider here is not just are those students considering Canadian universities or Australian universities or British universities at a higher rate and sort of in the same vein that they used to consider the United States. We're also seeing increased competition from their domestic alternatives. It's not uncommon, for example, in South Korea today to see South Korean universities promoting themselves as having strong ties to US universities. It's not enough simply to say that you can go to MIT or you can go to South Korea. South Korea promotes the fact that many of its university professors were trained at schools like MIT, like Caltech, like Stanford. This sort of argument that you can get the same education without having to leave home, and you're probably going to pay a little bit less here too because you're a domestic student and not an international student. That competition is ramping up quickly, and not just in countries like South Korea, and it's not just in areas that are pivotal to those economies. We're seeing this happen in the liberal arts, in the arts and sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities as well. So it's not just engineers and STEM students that we're at risk of losing, it's all of them. Even in China, they're pushing to develop greater liberal arts education programs to try to keep more of those students who might be coming to our institutions in country. And I think a big part of this transition too, and it's mentioned in the 4th bullet there on the right, is not only are there transitioning demographics in these countries, China and South Korea are not seeing population growth at the same rate that they have in years past, there are also funding challenges. Some of these funding challenges are in country, as we sort of describe here in Saudi Arabia, and some of those funding challenges are because of the way the US perceives students coming from certain countries and making it more difficult for them to enroll on a full-time basis. Now, a flatlining like this can seem not just concerning, but it can be fairly fatalistic for some schools who are overly reliant on international students. I don't want to paint this as too grisly a picture. I actually do think there's an alternative here. There are pathways forward. That's what you see at the bottom right side of the slide there with those orange numbers there. What we're not seeing in these flatlinings are actually some pretty positive pictures of growth in very specific areas around the world. In particular, we called out here that most universities aren't paying enough attention to the fact that they're getting 6 to 10% growth in some of the growing or emerging economies in the world. We called out Bangladesh, Brazil, Nigeria, and Pakistan as a couple of those here. But you can also think of the steady growth in India. India's young population in particular, is on the rise at a rate that outpaces the growth of China at its highest points. And so while growth from students in India is only at 3% today, you could really see this making up a lion's share of our population in the future, if we're ready to pivot and attract those students as well. And that's easier said than done in some instances. Again, I think there is optimism abound when you look at the world overall in terms of higher education enrollment. What you're seeing on this slide here is the projected growth in the number of students globally who will pursue post-secondary education in the coming decades. We're approaching a point where we might have 3 times as many international students looking for a post-secondary education opportunity by the year 2040. That's not that far away. And so what we need to think about is, how are we going to pivot today to begin attracting more of these students as that curve continues, and recognizing that we won't be the only ones competing for these student populations moving forward. Again, when we think about crafting an enrollment strategy to capitalize on the upswing you see in that bar chart, we need to think about the factors listed in that orange outlined box there. First of all is, where are those countries with favorable demographics? Sub-Saharan Africa and India are 2 really great examples. I mean, Nigeria was one we'd already mentioned, but we can also be thinking about, we can think about Kenya, we can think about Ghana, we can think about South Africa as places where we're seeing that increase in growth. We also want to look not just at the population side, but at the economic side. Where are those countries that are experiencing rising economic tides that not only stimulate more students to pursue a post-secondary education, but a generation later are then typically the countries that have high population growth as well. We also want to think differently, the third point there, about encouraging student mobility. I talked to a university in Europe the other day who described this as, we'd love for our students to be able to move between universities the way citizens of the EU move so seamlessly between countries. We need to find better opportunities to engage students who, as somebody mentioned earlier, may not be ready to commit 4 years or 6 years of their life to one location, but perhaps are ready to commit a year or 2. Going beyond just the study abroad experience that is, let's be honest, partially academic and partially culturally immersive, and thinking more about how we can streamline those experiences to make sure that learning is at the forefront, but that cultural engagement piece remains central so that the student may consider to continue their career there. Now, again, I think there's optimism to be had in the international enrollment space. Naturally, though, there are challenges. And what we've outlined on the right side here is a lot of those challenges revolve around the U.S. domestic policy. Delays in processing student visas is, again, something that had started pre-COVID and something that we've really butt up against. The unlawful presence policies is another one, really restricting a student's ability to remain in the U.S. During their breaks or after they graduate. That also complicates their ability to get a job here in the U.S. after they graduate. And we've seen some of that with the OPT program restrictions that have come out just earlier this week. Certainly, travel bans issued by the State Department have made this tougher on us. Not only is there a fear of our students not being able to make it to the university, they're kind of afraid once they're here, they might not have the opportunity to go home. And certainly during COVID, that tension probably keeps more students at home than we might think. And so as we get a little bit further into how COVID-19 and how the ramp up toward the election has affected this, you can see a few more of those things. Being 12 days, if my math is right, out from the election now, certainly the uncertainty about travel restrictions remains high. Our failure to contain the virus has not only caused our campuses to go remote, but it's caused sort of a global agreement of a loss of confidence in the US's ability to handle things like this. And the continuous rhetoric about anti-immigration draw up those concerns about xenophobia. Again, going all the way back to that Times Higher Ed article headline, there is a perception globally that is, at least Times Higher Ed would say, is backed up by the facts that our students don't feel safe or welcome when they come to these campuses. And so what can we do to curb these? I'll very briefly walk through a couple practices that we've outlined here, and then I'd love to pause and get your all's perspective. First and foremost, reducing that cost to degree. We have for a long time used the ability to charge fully and extra international students to our advantage. And I would say the gig is up here. And I think our global competitors have recognized this. And so in order to adapt, we might have to think about practices like what Eastern Michigan is doing, where they are reducing the price for students, for certain students from certain countries to come here at the same price as a non-Michigan interstate student, or perhaps even in some instances paying the same tuition as an in-state student. Moving over to thinking about our test flexible and test optional policies, and not just applying them domestically, but abroad too. NYU's done a great job saying that it will take not just the SAT and the ACT, but several of those international exams can also count toward a student's credit here. That test flexibility, again, in a world where it's a lot more difficult to take the SAT remotely in another country today, I think this is going to yield NYU quite a bit. Jumping down to the bottom left there, facilitating international career placement opportunities. I think this is best done industry by industry, but looking at the universities, the technical or vocational schools in other countries where there is a need for more advanced degrees and more advanced thinking, and how can we leverage the unique strengths of our institution to plug in here. Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University has done a great job of this, as you can imagine, in the aerospace field of identifying schools that are looking for more advanced training and more advanced degrees and forging those partnerships to help create a steady stream of students coming and going from their institution. And then last but not least, investing in those asset-light global networks. At the turn of the century, I think the theme to have was everybody needed to have at least 3 other campuses outside of the United States. I think in 2020, with the advent of things like Zoom and our ability to reach different populations in a virtual environment, we can think less about the physical assets and more about the engagement assets, which will also help reduce the cost burden of making those engagements for a school who can't afford to have 5 different campuses outside of the US. So I walked through this quickly and I realized enrollment's a big piece of this, but I wanted to turn back to our questions here. I've grayed out the middle one because I don't think it's quite as relevant, but would love to hear from some of the panelists and some of the folks in the attendee list. Let me know a little bit about what you thought about this personally. Let's start with question 1. Anything that you felt like you knew and are glad to have reaffirmed by the slides here? And likewise, anything that was a little bit different, anything that challenged what you thought you knew here, and that might prompt you to do a little bit more research. So again, panelists, feel free to unmute yourself and jump in here. Attendees, feel free to drop any questions or comments you have into the Q&A section.
I'll just start it off. This is Brad Bodenhausen again.
John, this is Cliff. I think one of the most interesting slides for me was the fact that the college age going population is going to significantly increase. The challenge becomes where they are located, right?
Right.
Because many of those governments then don't have the ability to help fund that college experience abroad. But and then I was not aware that India was continuing to grow. And so that's an area that a country we've looked at kind of semi-unsuccessfully over the last 4 or 5 years. And I just wonder if there aren't opportunities we ought to be further exploring there, given that continued growth.
John, this is Paula Moore. And I just got started with some initiatives in sub-Saharan Africa last year, right before COVID began, and that just kind of could have put a kibosh on that briefly. But I've been hearing exactly what you're saying there, and I attended another webinar recently where your stats were affirmed. And I'm hearing that there is a growing middle class in Nigeria and several other places in Africa where there is family support, enough family support to send students to the US, and they're looking for that kind of degree because of the lack of availability of quality higher education in country. So that does look like a really ripe area for us to grow over the next 5 to 10 years, I think.
This is Frank Einhellig. You confirmed a lot of things, I think, that, as several have said, that we've thought about and see happening every day. I was kind of curious that you did not mention the fluidity of what areas students are interested in their educational pursuits. In my experience, which is getting to be a little long now, agriculture and engineering were the big gun for most international. And we've gone through a period of business becoming a major high point, and it does continue to shift. And I guess you also alluded to the somewhat going back maybe 20 years of where our populations are coming from. But if you go back a little further, it wasn't Asia, at least it wasn't China that was on the radar. It was other places, and we were a big gun in Europe for a while.
Right.
And so that shift is a continual movement all the time, is what I'm getting at.
It is, and I there was one comment in the Q&A here that said the same thing, Frank, which is surprised to see how steep that growth is in prospective international or globally engaged post-secondary students across the next 20 years here. Paula made a really good point that I want to make sure I double click on, which is we're not just talking about the students coming from families that are traditionally perceived to be well off in other countries. There's an emerging middle class in many of these countries that we have never thought about in that way before. And as a result, the types of degree programs and the types of careers that those students are considering also look different. These folks aren't necessarily just wanting to come here to pursue their MPH or to pursue their degree in medicine. Man, sorry guys, tripping over my words here. Or pursue their MBA. They're also interested in the arts and sciences, the humanities, the social sciences, and part of it is that we have to make sure that they know that these skills and the lessons they learn can be translated back, because some of these countries do have a higher rate of students wanting to return to their home country than many of the countries we've worked with in the past. And that also brings up another point from the Q&A that someone had raised here, which is it's increasingly difficult to be sort of a global citizen in this context. I may come from another country and do my undergrad in the US with a desire to pursue a master's degree in another country or pursue a job or a PhD in another country after that. And that continuation is becoming increasingly difficult, not just because it doesn't always feel like my credits or my skills will transfer appropriately, but depending on what country I set foot in, I'm, and this is something we'll talk about in the next section, I'm almost being asked whose side I'm on, and if I can be trusted to have a good job or to sustain a good job in my new home country. And so that contributes to the difficult conversations that we have on campus today, not just with our 18 or our 20-year-olds, but with our faculty, with our staff, with our graduate students as well. And so it is becoming more difficult not just to benchmark and project where growth is going to come from and in what types of programs or in what types of degrees, but also what they want to do after they graduate. Yeah, there's a great question, as I'm saying here, there's a great question in the Q&A here about what degree programs will be important. That's a good question I can take back to our team. I don't know that we've seen concrete data yet, the kind of polling we can do here in the US about what types of degree programs students want to pursue. Haven't seen that in those regions that I've articulated, Sub-Saharan Africa and India, but it's a good one we can look into a little bit more.
John?
Yes.
Related to that, I was on a session with the Education USA forum that's taking place this week. And this session was on the Middle East. And they mentioned that healthcare programs are becoming very popular, like with Kuwaiti students and other students from other Middle Eastern countries, which is a huge change from 5 or 10 years ago, when those programs were not something that the government would even sponsor the student to pursue. So I think it is important, and Education USA can be a good source for us to understand what kind of programs students are looking for in those areas.
Excellent. And I think this question and sort of the dialogue we've had here naturally lends itself a little bit to question number 3 there about where we see the university going. in part, we need to go where the students are going to be, but the odds are good. We already have the right mix of things on campus that will be attractive to these students. We just got to make sure it's out in front of them. And so it's probably not so much on changing the structure of the institution so much as it is making sure that we're capitalizing on our opportunity to promote ourselves in the right places to the right students with the right pitch at the right time.
My guess is that the universities can be innovative, creative, and do all the things that we need to do, because we understand that. What we have to do, though, is figure out what's the political environment that's really framing the environment that we operate in. Mm-hmm. We're like any other industry. If the regulatory environment is such that you can't operate with any kind of faith and confidence, it makes it very difficult. We have programs that we want to invest in, mm-hmm. but we're nervous about it because they could be outlawed within the next few months. Who knows what happens? So I think the main content thing for me is what's the political environment? And I would argue that right now, given the political environment, it's even more important for Missouri State to be engaged globally. So I think we should triple our efforts to be engaged, even though the political environment is not conducive to it.
Excellent. Thank you, Jim. And I promise, folks, that was not planted. That's actually a brilliant transition as we move into the next section here, which gets into a little bit of both the politics and the policy of these things when we talk about that campus experience. I'll try to move through this section just a little bit more quickly so that we can stay on time here and so that I can get to some of the other questions that are popping up here. But wanting to get a little bit into how we got to the place we're in right now regarding how our campus populations feel about the trends that are happening across the world and the things that are happening right here in the United States. Our colleges have, for better or worse, always been a place where this dialogue tends to not only happen frequently, but happen at a high sort of magnitude. Our feelings about things are typically played out in a big way on college campuses. And so not only are we not just on sort of the higher end of globally conscious and globally aware populations, but we tend to experience the ebbs and flows in a much more aggressive way than other industries do or that other parts of the US do overall. I've given a couple historical examples here on the left. Again, some of these might date back further than you might remember, but it's important when you think about the history of higher ed and how we have managed different international changes. Going back to the 1940s and 50s, a constant feeling of that our faculty and that our staff were under investigation for their relationships with certain political parties in other parts of the world. Moving into the 50s through the 70s, when there was a constant barrage of our international students who were the targets of anger and distrust during periods of unrest and war. And that translates even into the early 2000s and into today. I think what we've laid out on the right here, you could say, is sort of the current flavor of this challenge, which is predominantly aimed at China. There's an escalating economic and political back and forth between the US and China, which has led to not just distrust of our faculty and our students from China, but that tends to sort of brush over and include all of Asia. And that increases the pressure for folks to be asked to pick a side. And that's not just here in the US. We talk to Chinese scholars who go home to visit family, who meet up with colleagues and are continuously asked, well, you're Chinese, but you hold a post at a US university. Whose side are you on here? And I think that really does contribute to this feeling of us versus them, which you'll see translated in a couple of the other places here. And I think, again, this is an area where COVID has really exacerbated these challenges, wondering if we need to be suspicious about certain populations because of the potential health risks that they pose to us, and haven't done a good enough job speaking with one voice to say that that's not the case here. So what happens then when campuses are at a boiling point? What are some of the things that can really push us over the edge? And then what are the international implications of that? I've sort of listed out 3 different scenarios here. Starting with the rise of bias-related incidents on campus. Again, this is something that well predates COVID. We can really point to the last 5 to 6 years here and the rise of bias-related incidents as reported by universities. Globally, this is the kind of data that gets picked up by agencies like Times Higher Ed, like the BBC, who are promoting not just in their own global news sources, but you can see in local news sources in other countries, the way they talk about the US student or the international experience in the United States is pretty negative. And that has an effect not just on the students that we're trying to attract, but on their families and their parents who might ask them to think twice before accepting that offer to a US school. Certainly contributing to that is the decrease in opportunities to stay. Again, this is both a policy and a political challenge where there aren't as many visas being offered, there aren't as many training programs, there aren't as many grants, and at the biggest level, there aren't as many guarantees that you'll be allowed to stay in the US after you complete your degree, which makes it really easy for another country to say, hey, if you're between these two programs, a US-based program and a program here at home, the one thing we can guarantee you is a job, and you'll never have to worry about the green card lottery. And so that pitch becomes a lot more appealing to an international student when they look at what's happening here in the US and how few students are being allowed to continue their work, even if they were told they would be able to just a couple of years ago. And again, I think that leads to the increased pressure to return home. So not just the pressure to stay home, which I think is largely in that second category, but even once these students graduate, the allure to pull them back home is growing much stronger. Not just from a sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, look at your opportunities here, but direct incentives. There are direct incentives in some of these countries, South Korea and Japan being great examples of students not only being incentivized with cash to return home, but then discounts on graduate programs. Come here, work for 3 years, and then go pursue your MBA locally. That has a much bigger value proposition than what we can offer here in the US right now. And so not only does that make us run the risk of losing them as undergrads, we then also run the risk of losing those students who stay in the US and then continue their education here at the more advanced levels. And if there's sort of one thing I want you all to take away from the risks of failing to retain international populations, I wanted to connect all the dots for you here, because I know that this might always feel fractured on a large campus like your all's. A decline in undergraduate international enrollment leads to fewer international students staying for graduate school. Moving on to point 3 there in my little snake, a decline in graduate student enrollment not only hurts us twice, if you will, it hurts us at the programmatic level, but then it hurts us because there are fewer international students to fill those PhD program slots. So now if we don't have a large enough pipeline to fill those PhD programs, which in certain disciplines can be upwards of 80 to 90% international students, we then have a decline in PhD students, which leads to a decline in the faculty candidate pools in those disciplines. And if we can't hire international faculty into these roles, either at the postdoc, at the adjunct, or even at the assistant professor level, we don't have that global representation in the classroom that convinces the next generation of international students to come to our programs, not just to come to the US, but to come to our program specifically. So I've sort of drawn this as a 9-step snake, but you can also see how step 9 can connect right back to step 1 if we're not taking serious action in those first 3 areas. So again, wanting to bring us back to our key discussion questions, this might be a good place to talk a little bit about question 2 as well. Are there actions you all are thinking about and want to think about differently, or want to think about more of when it comes to retaining our international students and faculty and staff, making them not only feel welcome, but genuinely being included? But then what are some of the things we need to start planning on that 5-year basis as we look toward the future of what Missouri State University's global engagement looks like? How do we want to factor retention and inclusion into those initiatives?
John, as we get the discussion and response started in this category, I might ask Patrick Parnell to jump in and just introduce something that we are doing that I think it's helpful if everyone watching today is aware of. We started an international student care and advocacy team to really respond to emotional wellness and bias response, particularly with what's come up in the last several months. And Patrick, if you would just kind of describe briefly how that's structured and the role of that group, because I think it's we're proud of having done that, and it was a needed thing, and it's in place now. if Patrick's not there, I can go ahead and talk about it. Basically, the way we handle international student interaction is we have someone who's generally the point person for each group or population of students, whether it's by region or particular program, area of study, whatever. And we put together a team of those people so that we can be doing more proactive outreach and try to create a situation where international students are more comfortable identifying challenges they're facing and be more inclined to exhibit help-seeking behavior. Because a lot of times, due to cultural differences or a sense of hierarchy, the perspective they may bring from a collective culture, they tend to be not inclined to ask for help or seek the resources that are out there. And right now, we're at a time certainly where that's even heightened due to the isolation a lot of students are experiencing. So we put this group together so that they can share information and be on the same page in terms of doing outreach with students. But the other side of it, the advocacy part, that's the outreach and care, but the advocacy is being a group that's representative of the needs of those students to communicate back to the appropriate units at Missouri State that provide that assistance, the counseling center, the bias response team, the dean of students. We have a great relationship with all those parts of our institution, but at the same time, it may not be the first thought to be culturally aware of some of the differences and some of the challenges that we face in serving these students. So that's the other side of it, and the role Patrick plays. Patrick and Deja Smith co-chair that effort for us, and Patrick's role primarily is working with the units within student affairs and throughout university administration that provide those services, so we can be more adept and responsive in taking care of those needs. So anyway, just short commercial, but I wanted to make sure everybody was aware of that because that's a new resource that's out there, and we're trying to be very active in making folks aware.
Excellent. Thanks, Brad.
I don't have a question, but just an observation. I think in the next 5-year plan, we really need to focus on recruiting and retaining international faculty. I think that's a key thing for us. One of the things that we are doing is that we're trying to identify good graduate level students that are really good that we can get on our faculty. We have a program called Grow Your Own Program where we actually send people off for their PhD. And so we have some programs that we can use to really help build up our expertise in faculty. But I think recruiting and retaining faculty international faculty is going to be a very important piece of what we have to do as part of the plan.
Right, and we didn't even get into the potential decline in those populations here in the U.S. Our ability to, our sort of ability to grow our own talent here in the U.S. is on the. We didn't even talk about the demographic fiscal cliff that we might be encountering here in the U.S., which today stands to impact that undergraduate enrollment. In 10 to 20 years, those are the same students that we're looking to fill faculty positions. And so our ability to get out ahead of this right now, I think somebody had asked the same question in the chat, so I wanted to double down on it. Thanks for bringing it up here. Is what are the incentives for retaining international faculty in the US? And they look very similar to many of the incentives we have to retaining our domestic faculty, but we have to create some of those flexibilities, whether it's the ability to take time away, to be back in the home country for a while, whether it's incentive structures that allow our children to attend the same university here. And it's a bit of a protection. It's knowing that my university has my back when the Department of Education comes wondering why I have so many emails from my colleagues in other countries, or why I'm actively working on a grant with a co-funder who is part of a country the US may not agree with politically right now. And so beyond sort of the normal incentives that you would think about, there's an increased degree of unification, or at least presenting a united front that we have to do in order to make our faculty, and I'd say our staff too, not only feel welcome, but feel safe. Others here, as you think about the next 5 years and some of the things that you want to double down on, or perhaps new things you want to introduce.
This is Peng Zhang from the Office of China Programs. Since we are on the faculty topic, I think like touch on Dr. Baker's mission, the importance of international faculty, and also I would think all the faculty here on campus will be good capital for our international program to connect with and drive to, because in the Q&A session, we see some question about promoting global consciousness and education, global citizens. I think it's a key for us to think about how to connect with our faculty to integrate some international or intercultural elements to the curriculum that could help with help to develop our capacity and ability to develop our international global citizens, and also will expand our ability to do more innovative academic programs.
Yeah, and I saw that question in the Q&A too, and I regret to say the answer to what is the US's approach to this, what is the national strategy, there isn't one, regrettably. And so it really is on us, on our individual campuses, to develop how do we as a campus want to engage those communities and protect those communities, and not just treat them as entirely different, but how do we ensure that we're all contributing to those same goals here? And unfortunately, it has to start at our level and move its way up, because for the moment, and I don't know that there will be sort of a greater national effort to make those engagements happen. So I think it's a really important point.
John, this is Brad again. Particularly important for us is the messaging of that. I think in the lack of having a national, not only not having a national strategy, but frankly having a significant part of the population that is isolationist and protectionist oriented, but yet we're living in a time where we obviously realize the issues we deal with are global. So my personal feeling is that our public affairs mission opens the door very wide for us to be aggressive in that area and to have a message, but the why is what we need to answer. Not just so much for international students coming here, but for U.S. Americans who just don't have that perspective of why it's important, and thinking about the professional skills that someone learns by having a study away experience or by interacting in a virtual classroom or something like that. I think we need to be better at coming up with the messaging and the ability to send that out to get a broader part of our campus community engaged in international experiences, whether they travel abroad or not. Having that opportunity is something we provide here, not just for the campus, but for our community. I mean, we're one of the more international oriented institutions in our region, and that gives us, I think, an opportunity to be clear and assertive in putting the message out there of why that's important.
Definitely. I have unfortunately said the same thing for the last 3 years now, but I think we are at a time where public universities in particular need to be doing a better job telling their story overall. As we encounter the resistance nationally and even in our own states, in our own communities, about the funding of higher education, the use of taxpayer dollars for research, the use of taxpayer dollars, or our public universities recruiting internationally. We have good reasons for doing so. And those reasons aren't just ones that we make up. There are quantifiable positive impacts that come behind them. We just haven't done a good enough job telling the rest of the world that. And it starts locally. We're seeing more universities do a better job telling their story to their immediate communities and at least to their states. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. The trick is that we can't constantly be on the defensive and just absorbing the criticism that comes our way. We've got to turn the page at some point and become proactive in making sure that we are the ones telling our story, and we are ensuring that the stories are followed up with the positive contributions we make back to our community time and time again. I talk to research universities about this every day, and it's something I'd love to see more of. And it sounds like it's something that, as you all think about your 5-year plan, you all have those hallmarks in mind, you have those impacts in mind, and you have the stories to tell. A 5-year strategic plan is exactly the time where you're collecting and cultivating those stories. The next step is to find a way to make them public and to do it in a big way. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move on then to the next section here, which is about research. This is an area where we're going to talk about how global engagement in the research community is changing. This is one of the few areas where I'm going to talk about both the challenges as well as some of the benefits. Again, I've got 3 slides on global research and what it looks like for a university. And the first 2 might leave you wondering if it's even worth it to do global research. So we're going to conclude on a slightly more positive note in this section and talking about why global research engagements remain an essential part of university engagement. In this section, we talk a lot about China because I think this is where a lot of the headlines are today. China has certainly been on the rise in the scientific community. Again, you can't open a newspaper with a business or an economic section without reading headlines like the one you see on the left here. China declared the world's largest producer of scientific articles. That was just earlier this year. China overtaking the US in scientific research. This was published last year by Bloomberg. And Tsinghua University may soon top the league rankings in science research. Again, as we saw the new global rankings come out this summer, there is a greater presence, not just of universities in China, but having them in the top 25 and having them in the top 50. There's a perception among people who don't follow these trends closely that this sort of happened overnight or it came out of nowhere, when in reality, it's been a very focused, very concentrated effort in China for the last 20 or so years to make these progressions. And the US has responded in some of the ways you see here on the right. And again, most of them have been somewhat defensive and somewhat combative. Starting with the suspicion about national priority. Here in the US, I like to provide this example. The US, arguably, does not have a federal scientific prioritization strategic plan. We have several major federal agencies that fund research that is intended to be an equal balance of investigator-driven and occasionally prescriptive and applied. But for the most part, we fund explorative research across a number of different disciplines. There is a suspicion then of scholars who come from countries that have a dictated national agenda of technological and innovative advances. And we see that playing out on our campuses, mostly by meeting those scholars and meeting those students with resistance. That then translates to foreign national suspicion. So it's not enough to just be worried about someone's loyalty, but assuming any assimilation with this country somehow prohibits you from being objective in your research. This goes beyond just our international postdocs and our international faculty. This translates to our domestic faculty too. Some of the most high-profile arrests in the last couple of months from the Department of Justice have been American citizens who are being accused of failing to disclose their ties to certain international programs and international talent pools. And that leads to this broader foreign engagement suspicion, where in the future, we run the risk of entering a world where any engagement with any international party is viewed with a high degree of skepticism, and there is so much regulatory work that has to go into forging that, that we ultimately walk away from it thinking it's not worth it. Now, what happens is when you see a Harvard professor, to use an example, being walked away from his office in handcuffs, it's easy to assume that there are very real problems here, or that perhaps we are sort of glossing over the major challenges. What you see here is there's actually a weird mix of things that are genuine challenges and things that are largely political posturing on the global scale. So what I've tried to do here in this slide is cut through the noise a little bit and provide you 6 of the areas where I think there are genuine problems that we face as US universities in engaging in global research. Starting with that loss of top talent, and that can, again, be intentional or not. Whether we mean to exclude this talent from our university labs or not, we're already doing it. We do it through our rhetoric, we do it through our trade policies, we do it through our visa policies. We are intentionally excluding scholars from different countries from participating in especially US taxpayer-funded research. Part of that is because of point number 2 there. There is a growing fear of espionage in sensitive labs. And again, if you read the headlines of the articles from this year, you might believe that the number of these cases is on the rise. When in reality, what you're seeing in the headlines is a lot of folks who are being questioned about a failure to disclose certain engagements, not because somebody is stealing state secrets. We have seen a couple high-profile cases of that, one in this year in particular and a couple in 2019, but not nearly at the clip that the sort of a quick read of the headlines might have you believe is happening. What is happening more is that third point, though, direct influence of ongoing research. And again, this can be both willing and unwilling on the part of the participants. The ability for a country or a company to influence our research using gifts, using grants, using connections, or even using several degrees of separation to make sure the people they want are doing the work that they want that benefits them in the end. Pulling up a little bit and looking more at that meso scale here, we've seen an increase in the number of cyber attacks against universities. I think this is one where COVID has really exacerbated this trend, where research universities that have been actively working on COVID vaccines have found their research work come under fire from hackers all over the world, attempting to access the data, attempting to find the cure sitting on someone's hard drive already, because the goal here is not just to take that research and make it available to their citizens first, but to then profit from the rest of the world on the ability to do something faster, to do something sooner, to do something at a larger scale than whoever is doing the original research here. That leads us to that intellectual property theft and the fear of intellectual property theft. This is what has largely driven the restrictions that we already had in place prior to 2019 in a lot of our research laboratories. And what happens at the end of all of this is what I've called the abdication of global leadership. For a long time, if you wanted to be at the cutting edge of your field, if you wanted to be doing research that was genuinely pushing the boundaries of your disciplines, you could do so by becoming a professor or attending a university in the United States. That value proposition has declined in recent years, because not only are there viable alternatives, again, if China has overtaken the US in terms of scientific prowess, number of articles published, there are ripe alternatives out there, but that sort of the veil of scrutiny that's applied to a lot of that research, especially if you don't come from the US, makes it a lot less appealing a place to conduct research that you're hoping to build an entire career around. And so again, as you see these 6 things, some of these have real challenges. Some of these are genuine problems that our universities have to solve. You can also see how quickly they grow out of proportion and grow out of scope and scale. And it frankly scares a lot of universities away from wanting to engage in global research in the future moving forward. And so that's where I feel the need to sort of call out where the silver lining exists, where it does here. There are still many potential benefits to global engagement in research. And I'll go a step further here and say there are a lot of potential benefits to global competition in research too. I want you all to think back to the last time the United States was genuinely in a scientific competition against another country. Certainly developing a COVID vaccine is the best recent example we have. But to find a good one, you have to go back to the space race. You have to think back to the US versus, if you will, the USSR. This was something that humanity wanted to see. We wanted to put a man into space, and then we wanted to put a man on the moon. And to do that, we entered an aggressive federal funding competition with the USSR. So our ability to secure more funding and sort of play off of competition is why a lot of our lawmakers in Congress will continue to ramp up the rhetoric. Some of it's justified, some of it's mostly political theater to see if we can't use this as an opportunity to secure more research funding for us moving forward. The bigger research we're doing, the closer we're getting to solving some of these complex societal challenges. Healthcare is the one top of mind for everybody, but hunger, sustainable energy, making sure everybody has access to clean drinking water, a basic, what we would call K through 12 education. These societal challenges have sort of been on the table for a long time. And the cutting edge research that we're able to do when we're in competition is what helps us move the ball forward at a faster pace. It also gives way to the next generation of scientists. And I think if you look at the long-term effects of the space race, this is arguably the place where the ROI was the highest. Not only was it inspiring to see scientists working on space missions and televised every night on the nightly news, but it came with funding for STEM education programs in our 5th grade classrooms, in our middle school classrooms, in our high school classrooms. And the generation of scientists that came out of it are the same people that are training our doctoral students today. These folks were funded with money that was directly came from the space race. And so what is going to be this generation's space race moment that not only encourages us to push past our scientific boundaries, but to engage the younger population in the US to not only take science seriously, but to think of it as a career where they can make a difference. And ideally that hits that last point, that helps us to create jobs along the way. This has always been sort of the elusive argument of the federal government funding research using taxpayer dollars, is the economic impact will become more clear as time goes on. As we approach a world that looks eerily similar to a recession, to the 2009 recession, where we have one-time stimulus funding coming in the door, there will be legitimate questions about federal spending. And we run the risk of seeing that federal funding for research decline because we spent a lot of it to help get us through the last couple of months here. And so the quote on the right there is from a New York Times article. It's actually from a French scientist talking about competition is actually a good thing. When you think about the context of developing a COVID vaccine, competition in research is what's pushing us to be first, but also to solve a challenge that genuinely affects the globe today. So again, trying to keep us on track, realizing we're going through that quickly. When you all think about research, what are some of the things that, again, were affirmatory here, maybe that challenged your views? And then again, what of them do you think you can integrate into how you see the university progressing in the next 5 years here?
I'm not sure I'll address your question, but in that history that you're talking about, a great deal of funding was pumped in from the federal level. And a good part of that was in education, that the education side led to the research productivity of the future. I do not see either of those on the horizon right now in the next 5 years that will affect us in a major way.
I think you've got a really good point there, Frank. And a lot of folks, and this is probably the biggest wild card for us in the next couple of months here, is there going to be another stimulus package, and what will it look like? A lot of folks look at the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 as one of those, I don't want to say large-scale transformative, but small-scale transformative federal investments of cash over a 3-year period, especially at universities, where we were able to use that money not just to make up some of the differences that we'd had, but to invest in new research facilities, to invest in new research faculty, smaller scale, certainly, but enough to have an impact to help get us over that hump and to continue paying dividends into the future. Unfortunately for research universities, that ARRA investment was followed by 5 years of declining federal investment from the federal agencies. So we have to be savvy and good stewards of those funds because we know they're coming at an expense. We're borrowing money from our future selves.
I think one of the challenges for us in the next 5-year plan is we're going to have to make some strategic priorities. So it's a priority to try to increase international enrollment, sustain it. Is it to focus on research? Is it to focus? So there's going to have to be some decisions made about where we put our focus, because there's only going to be so much resource to go around.
Exactly.
And one of the things we've done is we've developed a lot of agriculture, biotechnology, a lot of good research taking place in those areas. And so we'll probably try to sustain some of those. To me, it's always a personnel issue, because if you have a good research faculty member, you have to give them the opportunity to do research. Otherwise, you'll end up losing them. So, but we're still going to have to make some pretty tough decisions about where we invest our resources.
I think that's an emerging challenge for a lot of schools, is that we recognize under these circumstances, it's especially clear we can't be everything to everyone. And we have to decide not only who we want to be, but who we want to be for and where we're going to make those investments. There was a great comment in the chat that I've been waiting to come back to, which is so much of what we're talking about today is predicated on our ability to have a sustainable budget, to make sure that we are not only being good stewards of the dollars we have, but that we're being intentional about where we pursue opportunities moving forward. And that, again, we are concentrating in the areas that we think best represent our values and our long-term goals. That's a different playbook than even we had than when we were looking at even just 15 to 20 years ago, when we could genuinely map out 20 different areas and look for incremental growth. We're now having to really focus in on 3 to 5 things we want to do, not just really well, but better than anyone else. because we need to find those areas of strategic differentiation for student recruitment, for faculty recruitment, and certainly for research. Research is one of those good ones because a lot of us know that engaging in research, is good because our faculty like to do it. It's good for their careers. They know that it helps them engage in their disciplines in a deeper way. It also is part of our pitch to students. As a research university, we are confidently able to tell upcoming undergrads that they are being taught by folks at the cutting edge of their fields, as opposed to predominantly teaching institutions or institutions that don't incentivize or encourage research at a high rate. So again, when we come back to thinking about how we tell our story, research isn't just that thing we do out in the fields or in the ag business sectors, but it's actually something that has a tangible impact on the education our undergraduates get as well. That's one of the messages that I think gets lost in a lot of schools that are comprehensive, that do both teaching and research. We don't do a good enough job making sure we connect the dots there. Right, and as somebody is saying in the chat here, that also helps us to attract international students. Our ability to engage with other universities or other entities, be they companies or governments, in international research helps to grease our talent pipelines as well, whether it's for undergrads or in this case, graduate students, doctoral students, and faculty. I've probably pulled us a little too far here. Research is the area where I spend the most of my time. So I am always happy to talk more about this. If you have questions, feel free to filter them into the chat here. We'll go ahead and move along to the last section of today's presentation then, which is about advancement, philanthropy, and development. This is, again, an area where you might expect that I was going to talk about advancement the way we talked about enrollment. Where are the donor pools of the future? In reality, unfortunately, I'm going to walk you through a fairly technical rundown of how different US policies are impacting our ability to engage with donors, friends of the university, and philanthropists abroad. I would say we're largely talking about gifts here, but a lot of the same principles extend to engaging with foreign companies. And so when we think about the difference between gifts and contracts, a lot of the rules we're about to talk about apply to both. And so it's good to keep in mind we're not just talking about our international alums who give back. We're talking about their families. We're talking about the companies they work for. We're talking about international foundations and charities as well. And unfortunately, I have to start very specifically by talking about the Department of Education, Section 117. This is, if you're not familiar with Section 117, you're completely forgiven. Department of Education, Section 117 is the base of rules that dictates what universities have to report on when it comes to international giving and international financial relationships. It requires universities to disclose through a semi-annual reporting gifts and contracts received from foreign entities that meet or exceed the $250,000 threshold. It's been on the books since 1965. It was amended in its fuller form in 1986. And again, if you don't know this policy by name, that's okay, because for the last, I would say from 1986 until, as the slide says, about 2017, it hasn't really mattered. This has been something we report twice a year, just like we do with our Clery Act data, just like we do with our student enrollment numbers and our financial aid numbers. It's just part of the package deal that we send back to the Department of Ed. And they, for the most part, have been relatively lenient on the enforcement of that. Sometimes we are not as good at cataloging all of our engagements that exceed that threshold. Sometimes we don't do as good of a job totaling up. When the same person has made 3 gifts and that third gift puts us over the edge, we don't do as good of a job reporting that or updating those policies. And for the most part, the Department of Education has done very little to enforce these standards and has very, very rarely investigated any institutions for violating Section 117. And that's allowed us to continue to deprioritize the compliance with these rules, to be somewhat inconsistent with our reporting and not have in place the right oversight. A lot of things changed in the last couple of years here. And I would say in particular, the Trump administration has used 117 as sort of a blunt instrument. We'll talk about this a little bit more on the next slide, but the scope of Section 117 is actually quite wide when you read it. It's not just that we expect universities to report on this, we expect them to be able to answer tough questions about why they are recording these gifts and these contracts. And that's what you see on the right side of that slide there under the present 2017 to 2020. We've seen the Department of Education use 117 to increase public scrutiny on universities. You saw a lot of press releases, whether it comes directly from Secretary DeVos or sometimes it comes directly from the Department of Justice, where universities are reprimanded for not only failing to report accurately their international gifts, but the DOJ has gone several steps further in not only prosecuting universities for failure to comply with 117, they're using the sort of court of public opinion here to try to turn it against universities. Just a couple months ago, there was a scathing report issued to Stanford where the DOJ, in complement with the Department of Education, demanded that Stanford turn over, I think it was 10 years worth of records on over 2,000 different foreign engagements. And they didn't just want to know who it was that was funding these contracts and gifts over $250,000. They wanted to know why they were doing it, what they were funding, how Stanford came about the relationships that yielded those dollars. Sort of this process by which by asking a lot of probing questions, we insinuate a degree of guilt or that there's something shady happening here behind the scenes. What that's forced universities to do is it's ramped up the pressure on us to comply with this. Not only do we have to sort of catch up for the last couple of years where we haven't been as good, we probably have to increase the number of staff we use in this section. We might even have to, if you're a school at Stanford's level, you might have to buy a new reporting platform that allows you to better capture this data. It has increased not just the administrative burden, but the unease with which we now view a lot of our international funders, our international donors, and our international partners. And that leads us again to a series of potential impacts based on how the current administration's Department of Education and Department of Justice force us to think about it. Again, starting with partnerships in the top left there, it's easy to see how this could suppress international activities. Not only do universities feel a little bit less easy about engaging international donors, our donors probably feel uneasy about it. The companies that we work with abroad might not be willing to make engagements or contributions at the same rate or at the same size as they have, both because of the new formalized barriers, but also because of some of these perceived or informal barriers that are cropping up. That impacts international giving at a pretty high rate, especially the ability to give anonymously abroad. Donors who liked to make their contributions anonymously, either because they didn't want their name attached to it here in the US or in their home country, aren't able to do so, at least not at the same level they were anymore. That's the kind of thing that could get any of us audited in 2020. And that really does ramp up the compliance burden on us. Not only do we have to do more of the due diligence on the front end, we have to be far more thorough about our reporting on the back end, which, jumping down to the bottom there, opens us up to greater liability and risk, dramatically expands the regulatory and compliance risks of the institution and of the individuals who we're engaging with. It brings into question a lot of the financial practices of our industry. When a school like Stanford gets reprimanded, it's easy to say, well, that's a Stanford problem. It doesn't affect a school like us. But it wasn't that long ago that Stanford's inappropriate use of a research vessel instituted the entire facilities and administrative indirect cost recovery scheme that now governs all research at universities. And so when there are public, large-scale examples of named and known sort of well-branded global universities doing things wrong, especially at the expense of the American taxpayer, Congress has often used that as an excuse to put in place stricter rules on all of us. And so a good thing to keep in mind there. And again, part of that is because this scope of 117 is so wide and gives so much leeway to the Department of Education to pursue different cases and make different styles of recommendations to the Department of Justice, that we're not actually sure what the next change could be and how it would impact us. There's a lot of talk right now, for example, of lowering that bar from $250,000 engagements down to $100,000 engagements. And there's a lot more activity at that level. What if it sinks below that and we're talking about any investment from any foreign entity? You can see how complicated it gets and how much it would increase our compliance burden. And for me, it sort of it contributes to these macro trends of international philanthropy in the new era that we have to be cognizant of, because again, we know that we don't want to move away from this. If anything, we want to double down on our ability to solicit donations and contributions abroad, to forge partnerships internationally that have a financial component. We have to be mindful of the forward trends that we've laid out here on the slide. First and foremost is the economic volatility brought on by COVID-19 and the potential disruption of continued trade tensions between the US and other countries. This is not only going to impact sort of the cash on hand of the folks we engage with to make contributions, but also how they view the potential ROI of their gift and measured against the risk and scrutiny they take on personally by making it. Coming back all the way to the first section where we talked about enrollment, we also have to think about the new wealth centers around the world. And not surprisingly, they're in a lot of the same areas that are now producing more college-age students that we're pursuing, specifically in East Asia, the Middle East, and in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. We can't just think about our wealthiest donors only coming from Europe or China. They can be coming from a lot of other places now. And again, if we're not open to it and actively looking for those engagement opportunities, we run the risk of leaving dollars on the table. We also have to be a lot more careful of these nationalistic governments. And that includes some of the policies here in the US that are being scrutinized for international relationships. It is not as politically savvy to make a donation to a university in the US when your home country is actively trying to ramp up its own activity to recruit more of its own domestic students. And you run the risk in different countries of everything from being scrutinized by the political parties all the way to potentially being prosecuted for making those engagements. And that leads to that last point at the bottom right, which is this emerging global competition for donors. Not only are there sort of sticks to counter folks from making donations to the US, there are also carrots to incentivize them to make more contributions domestically, whether it's tax break policies, whether it's flexible terms of agreement. I think a really good example of this is Canada and Japan have done a great job recently encouraging domestic companies to invest R&D dollars domestically. As you can imagine, most automakers in Japan, most cell phone providers in Japan have done a lot of their R&D research with US universities. The Japanese government's put up quite a bit of money. I think it's the equivalent of about $3 billion US to try to encourage those companies to move those R&D funds back to domestic universities. Now, it's not enough to really hurt any one given university in the US from a research standpoint, but it certainly impacts our ability to engage with those companies long term. And you can see how the same trends, if different countries adopt very similar practices, you can see how eventually the sort of tidal wave of that could really impact us. So again, turning back to our discussion questions, I think this is a good place to revisit on the advancement side. Are there new actions that we want to take, or are there things we want to think about differently? And then as we project out 5 years for the university, how do we think our engagement with international donors and philanthropists will change? I'll even start with a more simple question. Maybe some of you all saw, no, Cliff, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say most of our work has been on the contract side as opposed to the philanthropy side. And so I don't know if Dave Meinert or Kent Reagan want to kind of weigh in on this topic, but we have not been, we have not been successful on the philanthropy side, but we have been very successful on the contract side, both with corporations, governments, universities. And I think the new world changes the potential, right? If we're contracting with Chinese, the Chinese government to educate people, well, there are folks that think that's a bad idea now.
Both in China and here in the US, yeah.
Indeed.
And I'd say it even goes a degree deeper. Even if that contract is with a third-party organization that links us up with high school equivalents in different parts of the world, those organizations are now on a list that the Department of State has put out and said, you need to be careful when you're working with groups like this. And if they show up on our reporting forms, even if they don't come in at that $250,000 mark to make it into 117, we open ourselves up to public scrutiny. that database for I was going to mention, folks, is now publicly available as of about 3 days ago. The Department of Education has put out an entire list where you can search by school of folks who reported international gifts and contracts above that threshold, and it's all available at your fingertips. And so it's only, I'm surprised we haven't seen more articles from local newspapers asking, why did our university take $500,000 from somebody in Swaziland was a strange example, again, coming back to Stanford. And so I think we are going to see the transparency will initially be met with scrutiny. And so that does change the not only who we engage with, but how we engage with them.
My experience in working with particularly with Chinese universities is that the good partner universities, even though the government is not necessarily very supportive or super supportive, they still really want to work together. And I think higher education folks, no matter where they are in the world, tend to view the world in a similar way. And we do want to work together and do things. So my experience has been, even though it's not popular or whatever, the partner universities, at least the ones I'm working with, have been as strong in their relationship building as ever. But the environment really does step in and keep you from doing a lot of things you want to do. But I think the desire for partnerships is still very strong.
Totally agree.
Could you answer one other question? You alluded to it, but I'm not sure that I have a good feel yet. There's an increase in the what you might call college age student population of the world, as you've made very clear, that's international. But at the same time, many of the countries like China have developed their own major good universities. So are those two things beginning to offset each other, if I'm making myself clear?
Yeah, it's tough to say looking forward, but you can imagine a world where I think it was 600 million by 2040. It took, let's use China as an example. It took the top universities in China 20 years to go from primarily domestic feeder schools and with some engineering specialties to global research powerhouses that attract talent from all over the place. And so if we project forward 40 years, yes, there might be a 3x increase in the number of international students, but any country seeking to replicate the rapid growth of China will obviously have to make significant investments. But you can imagine a country like India, like Nigeria, like South Africa, making those investments in just a handful of universities and seeing the same degree of success. So yeah, I think we run the risk of those two things potentially canceling each other out. There might be more people available. The options there also might be more options of places for them to attend. There's a third complicating variable, not to go too far down this, but somebody had raised it in the chat, which is, Zoom is not perfect for virtual education, but it certainly has increased the number of people thinking about how to perfect the virtual education experience. You can imagine that it's only a matter of time before even a student who grows up in a more rural neighborhood can access a university caliber education from the comfort of their home, from the comfort of their cell phone or from their laptop. And so not only are we going to be competing with those students at their domestic universities, we're also going to be competing with probably less expensive virtual options. I'm a little bit more skeptical about that third point, though. Again, we thought Coursera, we thought edX, we thought those would really be the Khan Academy. We thought those would be the harbingers of the end of our industry as we knew it. And, 10 years out, we've seen some impacts, but not nearly at the level that was projected if you go back and read the headlines from the early 2010s. And so, but yeah, I think you're right on in saying that there's probably a world where these things balance each other out. And again, it comes back to our ability to differentiate our value proposition that really is going to separate us when it comes down to sort of picking between us and some of your domestic options as an international student. There was another question in the chat that I had failed to get to here, which is the projected composition of state-sponsored and self-supported international students in the future. This sort of touches on a couple of these different areas, so I did want to come back to it. Again, there's no perfect formula. We don't have the numbers exactly on what that looks like, but a lot of the trends here, I think, tell you that the number of state-sponsored students who come abroad is likely to go down, while the number of self-supported families is likely to go up. And I think the latter of those, self-supported families, are likely to grow at a faster pace than we lose revenue from state-sponsored families, largely because of the points we were talking about earlier with the rise of the middle class in certain countries. The ability to self-support, especially if we go back to that enrollment practice where we're not necessarily discounting, but bringing down the international price to be more in alignment with some of our domestic pricing, I think more students are going to be able to sponsor themselves. There's another scenario, bear with me here, but there's another scenario where the world becomes increasingly bifurcated, where the US has sort of named and known allies, and we develop stronger recruitment patterns within those countries at the exclusion of other countries. So we might actually get the chance to get more state-sponsored students from Europe than we do right now, but they would come at the expense of students from China, students from India, or other countries that have aligned themselves with China. That's a pretty extremist view of one potential scenario, but it's certainly one that international scholars talk about that would impact our ability to recruit those students. So it's a great question I wanted to make sure I came back to before we wrapped up here. All right, well, I see we've got just a couple minutes left, so I'll go ahead and take us into the last two slides here. This is where I wanted to give a chance to look a little bit forward and to give you all a framework to think about international partnerships. Again, I bet a lot of the things we've talked about here are scary. They don't make it sound like international engagement is always worth it. And so recognizing that I largely believe, and I hope you all still believe, that those international engagements are worth it. We just need to think differently about them and how we pursue them today. I wanted to give you all a framework to take home to do that thinking and to do that thinking differently. So what I've done here is sort of map out why what was once a sure bet is now a risky investment. Again, this is really a recap of a lot of the things we've talked about today. But across the left-hand column here, you see the historical opportunities that we associated with international engagement in these areas. And on the right, I've summarized the present day risks that we've spent the last hour and a half here already talking through. So I'll walk through them quickly. Historically, when we thought about international enrollment, just as one example, we knew that the tuition revenue was going to subsidize our flat or declining domestic enrollment. Presently, though, our global instability, shifting markets are not yielding the same financial return. In the advancement world, we'd say the cost to raise a dollar has gone up. I would say the same thing is true for recruiting international students. The ability or the cost to recruit one international student now costs more than it used to. We have to cast a wider net, and that costs more money. It takes more manpower. It takes more resources. Campus experience, again, having a positive experience yielded long-term engagements, not just for our alums happy to ask their children to consider coming to the same school they attended. They were also likely donors of the institution, and some of them still are donors. But as that campus experience becomes more negative, not only do we risk disengaging those students, we disengage the neighborhoods they come from in their home countries who hear nasty things from their parents about what their child is experiencing. And now that entire neighborhood, that entire community has a negative perception of either our university or the US overall. Same thing's true in research. And again, I really do agree with the comments made here about collaborations increase our global exposure, our funding, and our discoveries. But as they come under greater scrutiny, it'll be hard to convince our faculty to keep going. And it's not just because those partnerships will be scrutinized, it's because we as a university have to put stricter rules around them. So we have to constantly remind them that those engagements are worthwhile. Then again, on the advancement side, expanding the donor pool to regions of wealth and enthusiasm for the university now comes at the expense of the political backlash and increased oversight, which can lead to a decreasing financial return. And this leaves us with two questions when we're vetting our new international partnerships. Are the opportunities still great enough? And how much risk exposure are we comfortable with? The answer to the latter question isn't zero. It can't be zero. We can't be uncomfortable with any amount of risk. We know we have to take on some level of risk. So very much like setting our strategic priorities, one of the other questions we have to ask ourselves is, Where are we comfortable taking on this risk? In what areas, and at what levels? And I think that really will help us lead back to, are those opportunities still great enough to pursue them? So that's a lot of questions. Wanting to give you a little bit of at least a framework in which to answer them. What we've put together here is what we've called the sample international engagement principles. I actually borrowed this directly from MIT and Cal Berkeley. This is sort of an amalgamation of their two international engagement principle books. What it does is it takes 4 components to international engagement. It gives you a couple critical thinking questions to ask for each of them. Starting in the top left corner of our puzzle there, we want to find international engagements and partnerships that share the university's fundamental values. Is the partnership equally accessible to all students and faculty? Again, we can think about this from a study abroad perspective. Can our students who have learning disabilities still make the best of this experience? And if they can't, is that something we need to work on? Does it uphold our institutions or our states or our country's values? This was an interesting one. The MIT example here actually explicitly calls these Western values. Does the partner uphold Western values? That's a very 2020 statement. It's the kind of thing that we would have been more comfortable with in previous administrations, but for fear of the scrutiny or the fallout that might come with it, we might need to think more critically and more narrowly about those partnerships. I'm not advocating that you all set the standard at Western values, but at least thinking through what standards you would want to set around where do we draw the line on certain values is a good one to think about. Jumping to the teal one there, does the partnership advance the university's core mission? Does it advance knowledge and discovery, and does it strengthen the student learning experience? Again, in a world where we used to have 30 or 40 study abroad options, do we want to rein that into just a core couple and double down on the experience there to make sure that the students who go through that get the most out of the experience, to make sure that the faculty or the staff that engage in our international partnerships are actually doing so in a way that helps advance their knowledge and helps them perform better in their roles and deliver better results to our students and to our other stakeholders? Does it benefit both partners? I think this is one the US has had to grapple with. Historically, US universities have probably been the primary beneficiary of a lot of our partnerships abroad. And increasingly, we're getting pushback from our former partners abroad who say, this relationship has felt pretty one-sided, and we want to make sure we're getting something out of it. We also see this here domestically. As people question the ROI of a college degree domestically, we see it abroad too. So having the value pitch be, hey, we're going to educate your students and they're going to come back and bring their knowledge and their skills back to your home country, it doesn't work as well as it used to. And so we have to think about those mutually beneficial partnerships and how we articulate on paper what those mutually beneficial partnerships look like and why we want to engage in more of those in the future. And then just like the last slide, the last prong here is, does it balance the risk and the opportunity? First of all, that means we need to understand what the risks of these partnerships are. And we also need to come up with a framework with how frequently we're going to review our partnerships. Again, this comes partially from MIT, who in the last couple of years has stood up a new 3-pronged committee to review all forms of international engagement. Everything from a donation from a donor who lives abroad all the way through to massive multi-million-dollar research contracts from global countries now goes through a different 3-step review process to make sure it's something the university wants to be engaged in. Again, there's a financial liability there. There's also a reputational liability on the line of engaging with the wrong partners at the wrong time. And so a lot of universities are having to add administrative barriers to thinking differently about these partnerships. But I think this actually, beyond being scary and helping protect us from violations, this also helps us to focus strategically. This makes us think about the kinds of things that are genuinely best for our students and best for the university. And this gives us a framework with which to consider all of those different partnerships and a lens to sort of funnel them all through. So I figured this would be a good place to end one last time with these questions. We've got about 10 minutes left here. Any last thoughts or questions or responses here? Any, again, things that we've learned that are new or that challenged us, actions that we feel empowered to take now with the results of these presentations, and anything we see changing in the way we view the 5-year plans?
I think the results of the presidential election will have a significant impact on the analysis of whether the return on investment is worthwhile.
Totally agree, Cliff. I'll offer you something I offer to a lot of our partners in research, which is that it is easy to assume that a Biden administration is the antithesis of a Trump administration. When it comes to some of these components of international engagement, I don't think we should be too quick to assume that a Biden administration does away with all of the new barriers put in place. Again, some of the things we've unpacked today are about real problems between the US and other countries. And I don't think a Biden administration will be too quick to do away with everything. Certainly some of the immigration rules, they've already said they will. Restrictions on visas, they've already said, sort of a day one initiative, if you will. When I think about Section 117, when I think about foreign interference, there will probably be some changes to those rules. I don't think they'll be done away with altogether. And so I agree. I think the election has big impacts. I want to make sure we don't overly simplify the results of the election of being one thing or another.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think, as you said in some of the slides, there are real issues interacting with China.
Specifically,
but
yeah.
it's all in how you frame those issues and whether you want to work through them, and the tone of talking about them make a real difference in terms of the political cost you might pay, for example.
Exactly.
John, from my standpoint, I would thank you a lot for the framework. I think that's particularly helpful as we start this long-range planning process, and maybe call attention to that idea of identifying those 3 to 5 things that are distinct, that we really have put resources and energy into, and we do particularly well, and try to build on and expand in those areas. I think that's a good framework, a good way to think about it. We've definitely been entrepreneurial and try to be innovative in the way we approach international engagement and partnerships. So it's always, in a situation like this, we always see opportunity, but it's different, and it's opportunity is going to have to be weighed with that risk, of course, as you identify. So thanks for giving us that framework.
John, I'm still interested in the future projection of what field areas, discipline areas that you're seeing for international students to like the American education. For example, right now, the STEM areas in the United States are not heavily subscribed by domestic citizens, and they, have been reasonably subscribed by international, particularly at the graduate PhD level. And yet, I don't know whether that's a continuation. An earlier person mentioned medical areas, but we have been an importer of international talents that were trained elsewhere in the medical area for many, many years. So it's a curiosity that does shape our thinking of how we look at things to some degree in the future.
Definitely. And again, I'll pull back with some of our enrollment experts too to see if we've come across any analyses on the front of majors and programs that are of interest abroad. But you've hit a good point here about specifically about the STEM majors in particular. There's one thing I've mentioned a couple of times that I think a number of other countries do better than us, and that's make the connection between certain degree programs and certain employers more explicit. I don't want to paint the picture that higher ed exists solely to generate 22-year-olds with jobs or job-ready skills, but especially in some of the STEM fields, the connection between our engineering department and the companies that we want to be working with is essential. And in the US, we haven't done as good of a job forging those partnerships from a talent development standpoint. We're just now really seeing the early indications of that. Whereas if you were a student in China wanting to work for Huawei and you went to get your master's degree in computer science, you walk out of your door with your diploma right into your cubicle. And we in the US haven't done quite as good of a job making those pathways clean and easy to navigate. I think that's one of the things we're starting to see schools do a better job of, but something, if we want to remain competitive for those talent pools in particular, we're gonna have to think about that section a little bit more narrowly and intentionally. Paula, I saw you unmute yourself. Apologies for jumping in over you there.
Oh, that's okay. I really appreciate all the information that you've provided with us today, John. And I think to piggyback on the question that Dr. Einhelig brought up, I'm not sure that there is at this point anymore one or two major areas that we can say. I think it's very diverse and it really varies from one region to another, depending on where the country is in their development. And so, I was thinking about Colombia. In the past, engineering was a big push in Colombia, but now they've reached a certain level of development, and now it seems that students are really looking at all kinds of degree programs. So it really, I think it's becoming more and more diverse and less of a monolithic option that students are looking for. It's less easy to identify what those one or two degree programs would be.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a matter of making priorities or making decisions about where we want to be focused with our recruitment, and then paying attention to what's going on there and what the needs of the country are.
Exactly. And I think the other thing to keep in mind there too is the regions versus just the individual countries. Colombia is a great example. Brazil has not only done a good job growing out some of its engineering populations, some of its engineering programs in different universities, they've also done a good job bringing together the countries in South America to talk about growing engineering on the continent. And so our what would have been good prospective students from Colombia, from Peru, from Paraguay and Uruguay are now seeing their sort of connectedness between their domestic universities and some of the bigger universities in Brazil, who are sort of democratizing that education in specific fields. So we're not just sort of competing on the programmatic country to country level, we're competing with a region. We're competing with a regional development approach, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. It gives us the opportunity to engage a wider breadth of students, but we also need to keep in mind that Brazil will always be closer to home than Missouri is for a student from Colombia. And so how does our value proposition change at a more micro level? And I think, as with everything in the last couple of years in every private sector industry, everything is becoming more targeted. I suspect international enrollment is trending in that direction as well.
I think one of the things we have to do is that what we're saying is it's getting increasingly expensive to recruit and get international students in.
Yep.
Is the university willing to maintain the infrastructure necessary and willing to invest the dollars and resources necessary to continue to develop it? I would argue that it's worth it, but we're going to have to go through some really serious discussions as we develop the long-range plan about where we head.
Yep. And not only is it worth it to make the investments to recruit those students, but we've talked about how much more important it is that they have a positive experience here too. And frankly, how much harder it is to ensure they have a positive experience. Things beyond our control often. And so the investments don't stop the minute they click accept. The investments frankly never stop. We develop them even after they've graduated, even if they never come back to the university to pursue another degree or another credential. And so the investments are not, you can think about it as carrying them all the way from the day they admit to the university all the way through to when they retire. Yeah, Michelle, did you want to jump in here too?
Yeah, I just have a quick question. Those who know me will know that I'm very supportive of all our international activities, but in this challenging time, can you make suggestions on what we can do domestically to grow domestic partners, whether it be industry or other locations in the U.S. that have a population that is from one of these areas you've mentioned? What can we do domestically in the interim to help us get where we want to go internationally?
I unfortunately am going to defer that to my colleagues who are experts in our domestic enrollment. They will have much better answers than I do. The answer I will offer up right now is when I think about, it's already something I've mentioned, which is I think we're about to enter a period where our regions are struggling economically, and our ability as a university to be a good partner and a good steward of our region is, I think, what's going to help us attract talent from other regions nearby too. So thinking more at a state level, maybe crossing a few state boundaries, as our states enter a period of economic recovery as opposed to economic development, our ability to tie ourselves and demonstrate and communicate our engagements with our local community is what's going to attract students not only to come to the university, but ideally to stay at the university after they graduate. But I will defer that to the experts across EAB. There's a team of 50 folks who can answer that question better than I can. But it's a good one, and I'll make sure I get back with them. Perfect, folks. Well, right on time. I wanted to thank you all so much again for having me today. I'll make sure you all get a copy of these slides for your own records if you want to review them. And again, I am always happy to respond to emails, or if you want to drop us a line. Paul Gunther knows exactly how to get a hold of me, as do any of my colleagues that you all engage with. But so exciting to talk to you all at the point in this journey. I think you all are putting together an excellent forward-looking plan, asking all the right questions and probing in all the right places. So I'm happy to have gotten to be a small part of it today, and wish you all the best of luck moving forward.
Thank you, John. We appreciate everything you shared today, and we'll post this. This has been recorded, and we will post the slides once we receive them. I have the draft, but we would prefer to post the final slides. So we'll look forward to getting those and making those available to everyone. And thank you again.
Thank you. Excellent.
All right, remember, we've got another webinar next week, so hope to see most of you back for that. So with that, I think we're done for the day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.